The red light changes nothing. That is what you learn first. In a dark room, the red light does not alter what is already there, trapped in silver halide, waiting in the dark. The red light only allows you to see without destroying. Harlan Crisp understood this better than most men who had held a camera, because Harlan Crisp had been working with red light and chemical baths since he was 14 years old, apprenticed to a portrait photographer in Knoxville, who told him on his first day that photography was not about what you saw through the viewfinder. It was about what the chemicals decided to show you when the image swam up out of the developer tray, like something rising from deep water. He was standing in the back room of a boarding house on Everett Street in Bryson City, North Carolina, in the autumn of 1927. The room he'd converted to a dark room was small enough that when he spread his arms, his fingertips grazed opposite walls. He had taped black butcher's paper over the single window. The red safe light threw everything into the color of old rust. He smelled fixer and stop bath and the particular sweetness of fresh photographic paper. And outside that window, if he could have seen through it, the Tuckasegee River would have been running low and clear over its limestone bed. The last warmth of October still holding in the valley, the sourwood trees burning orange on the ridgelines above town. He did not see any of that. He was watching a photograph emerge. He had made this print before, or rather, he had made the exposure before on a Tuesday in early October when the Proctor community up on Hazel Creek had gathered for their annual harvest celebration. He had been working the camera all afternoon, moving through the crowd the way a careful man moves through any crowd of strangers. Slowly, with his hat in his hand, explaining himself before he raised the lens. He had shot nearly 4 rolls that afternoon, which was more film than he usually allowed himself in a single session. But the light had been extraordinary, the kind of slanted October afternoon light that makes ordinary things look consecrated, and the people had, after an initial wariness, mostly stopped noticing him. He had caught images he knew were technically excellent. He had caught images he suspected were genuinely beautiful. He had not known, until now, what he had caught with this particular frame. The print was emerging in the developer tray. He kept the agitation gentle, tilting the tray in slow rocking motions, the way his old teacher in Knoxville had shown him. And at first, it was only the shapes he recognized. The hillside, the long tables, the cluster of people in their good clothes. He had seen all of this with his own eyes. He had pointed the camera at it. He had composed the frame. But a photograph is not a memory. A photograph is evidence. And what the silver halide was presenting to him now, rising out of the chemical bath with the quiet patience of the undeniable, was not precisely what he remembered composing. Not because anything had changed, but because the camera had seen everything simultaneously, every face in focus, every detail present at once, in a way that a human eye, moving and selecting and discarding, never quite manages. The photograph showed him the whole scene with a completeness that his own presence in it had prevented. He leaned closer. The red light was adequate, but not generous, and he had to bring his face to within a foot of the tray. In the foreground of the image, he had not noticed this when he framed the shot, or perhaps he had registered it without processing it, the way the eye sometimes absorbs information. It doesn't immediately report to the conscious mind. Stretched a banner. It was hand-painted on what appeared to be canvas or muslin, suspended between two wooden poles that were held upright by a pair of young men on either side of the frame. The banner was perhaps 12 feet long. He could read it clearly even in the developer tray, even in red light, even at this early stage of development. The letters were large, carefully formed, black paint on white ground. Proctor Community, established 1830. Population 287, we will not leave. Harlan Crisp stopped breathing. This was not metaphor. His chest simply ceased its work. For a period of time he could not afterward have measured. He stood with his face close to the tray, watching the image continue to resolve, the banner growing sharper, the faces of the crowd behind it becoming more distinct, the tables laden with food clarifying their details. Over 200 people, he could see now, gathered on the hillside behind that banner. The autumn light caught in their hair and on the metal clasps of their overalls and on the glass jars of cider lined up on the tables. A child in the middle distance had turned to look at the camera at the exact moment of exposure, and she was laughing at something, and her face was... He found he had no words for her face that weren't inadequate. Open, alive, entirely at home. He pulled the print from the developer and slipped it into the stop bath, then the fixer, then the washing tray. He hung it to dry. Then he went back to his enlarger and made another print from the same negative. Then another. 3 prints total. He worked in silence, which was the only way he knew how to work when something had shifted underneath him. When all 3 prints were dry, he sat on the edge of the bed that took up most of the room when it wasn't serving as a dark room, and he looked at them for a long time. He was a professional. He had worked for the Department of the Interior for 4 years by then, photographing irrigation projects in Nevada, reclamation work in Arizona, federal timber management in Oregon. He understood what he had been hired to do in Swain County. He had been given a briefing document in Washington before he came south, a document that used words like documentation and historical record and community assessment, and he had read between those lines easily enough, being a man who had been trained to see what was outside the frame. He was here to photograph poverty. He was here to photograph decline. He was here to produce a visual argument that the mountain communities of the Great Smoky Mountains region were already fading, already half gone, already more memory than living reality, and that acquiring their land for a national park was therefore not a dispossession, but a mercy, not a taking, but a rescue. This was what the department needed from him. He had understood this before he ever set foot on the train in Washington. He looked at the 3 prints drying in the red-lit room and understood, with a clarity that came not from analysis, but from the part of his brain that processed images the way other people processed language, that what he was holding contradicted every line of his briefing document. 287 people. A banner painted by hands that knew exactly what was being taken from them and had decided to say so in the most public possible register. A harvest celebration so abundant that the tables were bowing. Children running in a field that had been cleared and cultivated by someone's great-grandparents. This photograph was not evidence of a community in decline. This photograph was evidence of a community that had been told it was dying and had responded by gathering on a hillside and painting a banner and making the largest possible meal from its own land's production, and inviting every one of its 287 members to come and be counted. He labeled it Exhibit A in his notes. The notation was partly ironic. He was not a lawyer, and these were not legal proceedings. And partly not ironic at all, because he was increasingly certain that legal proceedings were, in fact, what this was. He did not write in his notes what he understood this to mean. He wrote only the date, the location, the subject. Proctor Community Harvest Gathering, Hazel Creek, Swain County, North Carolina, October 4th, 1927, and then the two words, Exhibit A. He kept one print for his personal archive, which he maintained in a cardboard portfolio case that traveled with him everywhere. He set aside one print for the department's collection, labeled with his standard subject and date notations, indistinguishable in its packaging from the other 1,200 photographs he had taken since arriving in Swain County 6 months earlier. And the third print he wrapped in brown paper, with a note tucked inside. A note that said only, "Don't publish this yet, but don't lose it," and addressed the package to a man named Wallace Holt, who was the features editor at the Asheville Citizen-Times, and whom Crisp had known since they were both young men hanging around the edges of the newspaper trade in Knoxville, each of them certain there was more truth to be found in their respective crafts than the crafts were yet permitting them to express. He mailed the package the next morning from the post office on Everett Street. He did not know at that moment exactly what he feared. He knew only that the instinct to make 3 copies, to distribute the image rather than hold it, was an instinct he trusted. He had been a photographer long enough to understand that photographs were fragile, not in the chemical sense, but in the institutional sense. They disappeared, not usually through conspiracy, though sometimes through conspiracy. More often, through the ordinary mechanisms of bureaucratic entropy, misfiling, budget cuts, staff turnover, storage conditions, the general human tendency to preserve what confirms rather than what challenges. He had seen it happen before, in smaller ways, with less consequential images. He trusted his instinct. He mailed the package. He went back to work. To understand what Harlan Crisp found in Swain County and why the finding mattered, you have to understand what he expected to find. Because the gap between expectation and reality is itself the story. The gap that the Department of the Interior would spend the next several years working to close, not by adjusting the expectation, but by selectively presenting the reality until it fit. Crisp had arrived in Bryson City in late April of 1927 on a morning train from Knoxville with 3 camera cases, 2 boxes of glass plates, and a rolling case of chemical supplies. And he had come with a specific picture already assembled in his mind. It was not a picture he had invented. It was a picture he had absorbed over many years from newspapers and magazine articles and the broader cultural atmosphere of the 1920s, which had a very clear idea of what Appalachian mountain people were and what their lives looked like. The picture went like this: isolated, hollow communities, cut off from modernity, living in conditions that had not changed substantially since the 18th century. Barefoot children, gaunt women in homespun, old men with long beards who had never seen a railroad or a newspaper or a piece of manufactured goods more sophisticated than a nail, moonshine, feuds, illiteracy, the noble but doomed persistence of a people who had been, as one popular magazine article of the period put it, left behind by the march of American progress, preserved like insects in amber, their poverty picturesque, but their future non-existent. This picture was not invented from nothing. There were genuine hardships in the mountain communities of western North Carolina in the 1920s. The timber companies had stripped much of the surrounding land in the decades before Crisp's arrival, devastating ecosystems and local economies. The chestnut blight that had begun in 1904 and was still spreading in 1927 was in the process of eliminating the American chestnut from the landscape. A catastrophic ecological and economic loss for mountain families who had depended on the chestnut crop for food, lumber, and the fodder that fattened their hogs for winter slaughter. Some families were genuinely struggling. Some communities were genuinely thin on the ground. But the picture, as a totality, as an explanatory framework, was wrong. It was wrong in its details, and wrong in its implications, and wrong in the use to which it was being put. Crisp began to understand this on his very first day in Swain County, before he had taken a single photograph. He hired a local man named Jesse Welch to drive him up the river road toward the mountains. Welch had one of the few automobiles in the county, a 1921 Ford Model T that he drove with aggressive confidence over roads that, in Crisp's estimation, barely qualified as paths. And as they drove, Crisp watched the countryside and found it refusing to match the picture in his mind. The farms he passed were not the dilapidated affairs he had braced himself for. Some were modest, certainly, and some showed the wear of hard years, but others were genuinely prosperous-looking, well-maintained fences, orchards just coming into bloom, fields that had been plowed and seeded with a care that spoke of knowledge and investment. A woman hanging laundry on a line outside a well-built frame house looked up at the Ford with an expression that was merely curious, not the dull incuriosity of someone who had never seen a motor vehicle. He asked Welch about the communities along Hazel Creek, which was his primary assignment. Welch talked for the better part of an hour without much encouragement, and what he said did not sound like a description of communities in terminal decline. He described a grist mill that had been recently rebuilt after a flood. He described a school at Proctor, the largest settlement on Hazel Creek, where classes were held 5 days a week and where the teacher, a woman who had graduated from the normal school at Cullowhee, was by common agreement one of the best educators in the county. He described trade networks. The mountain families sold chestnuts and apples and galax and ginseng and homemade furniture and preserved food to buyers in Bryson City and Silva, and all the way up to Knoxville. And they had been doing so for as long as anyone could remember. He described community institutions, churches, mutual aid societies, a volunteer fire company in the larger settlements, organized hunts in the fall that served as much social function as they did practical ones. He did not describe, Crisp noticed, anything that matched the amber insect picture. He described a community that was poor by urban standards, yes, and that lacked amenities Crisp took for granted, yes, and that lived in ways that would have looked foreign and, in some respects, arduous to anyone who had spent their life in Knoxville or Washington. But poor by urban standards and living simply were not the same as the picture. The picture was about extinction, about a people who had already essentially ceased to exist and needed only to be formally acknowledged as gone. What Welch was describing was not extinction. It was a society. Crisp made his first working visit to the Proctor community on a Tuesday morning in early May of 1927, and everything he had begun to think on the drive up from Bryson City was confirmed and expanded and complicated in the first 20 minutes. He arrived in a settlement of perhaps 30 families clustered in the bottomland where Hazel Creek widened into a small flat valley. The houses ranged from the simplest one-room log cabin to what was, by any standard, a respectably built 2-story frame structure with glass windows and a covered front porch. There was a church, white clapboard, bell tower, carefully painted, a flower bed visible along its front foundation. There was a school, a single-room building with 4 windows on each side, from one of which, as Crisp walked past it, came the sound of children reciting something in unison. Geography, he thought, from the sound of it. Something about rivers. There was the grist mill that Welch had mentioned, its wheel turning in the current of Hazel Creek with a sound like slow applause. There was a store, Proctor General, the sign read, a hand-painted sign in good condition, and through the screen door he could see shelving stocked with goods that included, as best he could tell from the doorway, commercially manufactured products alongside home goods. And there were the orchards. He had not been prepared for the orchards. They covered the south-facing slope above the settlement in long, ordered rows, apple mostly, but he could see the knotted forms of pear and cherry as well. And in the May morning light, they were in full late blossom, white and pale pink against the dark green of the forest rising above them. Extraordinarily beautiful in a way that was also a clear record of sustained human investment, of generation after generation, choosing to plant and tend and harvest rather than abandon. He stood at the edge of the settlement for a while with his camera cases at his feet, just looking. A man came out of the general store and watched him from the porch for a moment before walking over. He was perhaps 60, Crisp judged, with the particular physical quality common to men who had worked outdoors their entire lives. Weathered skin, deliberate movement, hands that looked engineered rather than grown. He introduced himself as Calvin Proctor. His family, he said, had been in the valley since 1830. His great-great-grandfather had cleared the first field, which was still being farmed by his cousin 200 yards upstream. Crisp introduced himself and explained his commission as honestly as he was able. He said he had been sent by the Department of the Interior to document the communities of the Hazel Creek area as part of the process of establishing the national park. He said he intended to photograph everything he saw as accurately as he could render it. He did not say what the photographs would be used for. He did not know entirely himself. Calvin Proctor looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were a very pale gray, almost silver, the color of creek water in winter. "You'll photograph what you see," Proctor said, "or what they want you to see." "I'll photograph what's there," Crisp said. Proctor seemed to consider this. "People up here have been told a lot of things about themselves that don't match what we see in the mirror," he said. "I expect you've read about us in the papers?" "I have," Crisp said. "Then you know what kind of pictures people expect." "I know what kind of pictures I've been told to take," Crisp said. "I don't know yet what kind of pictures I'll actually take." Proctor nodded slowly. It was not the nod of a man who was convinced, Crisp thought. It was the nod of a man who was reserving judgment while granting provisional access. It was, in its way, the most intelligent response Proctor could have made. He got the access. He was in the Proctor community, at least 3 days a week for the following 6 months. And in that time, he came to know it with the specific intimacy that only a photographer, who is also a careful observer, can develop. Not the intimacy of friendship exactly, though some friendships did emerge, but the intimacy of sustained attention, of watching a place and its people across seasons and in varying light and in ordinary moments and in gathered ones, and accumulating, over time, a picture that was as close to true as any single observer's record can be. What he saw and photographed was this. He photographed the school, the teacher, whose name was Bertie Mae Higdon, standing at her blackboard on which she had written an arithmetic problem for the older students, while the younger ones worked at their primers at long desks. The students themselves, ranging in age from 6 to perhaps 14, serious or laughing depending on the moment, their clothes clean and their faces healthy. The school library, which was modest but real, perhaps 40 books on a shelf that someone had built with care and painted green. He photographed the school on examination day in June, when parents came to hear the recitations, and the room was crowded to its walls, and the children performed with the specific anxiety of children who know that what matters to them matters to the adults, watching. He photographed the grist mill, the miller, a man named Reuben Cable, who was 73 years old and had been operating the mill since he was 16, feeding grain through the stone mechanism with practiced efficiency. The mill itself, which was old but well maintained, the wheel recently repaired, the millstones dressed within the last year, the wooden housing checked against rot and rebuilt where necessary. He photographed the line of people waiting to have their grain ground, 6 families on the morning he chose, their wagons and mules, and the easy conversation of neighbors who have been having the same conversations for a generation and have not yet exhausted them. He photographed the medicine woman, though she would not have called herself that, whose name was Nora Cable, Reuben's wife, who was somewhere between 65 and 75 years old, depending on which version of her birth year you believed, and who maintained a garden of medicinal plants behind her house and a knowledge of their applications that was, Crisp came to understand over his months in the community, genuinely comprehensive, the product of a lifetime of practice and a lineage of knowledge that extended back further than anyone could trace. He photographed her garden in summer, the beds carefully organized and labeled in her own handwriting on wooden stakes, the plants themselves in the varieties and combinations she had determined over decades to be most effective. He photographed her consulting with a young mother about a child with a persistent cough, both women leaning over the kitchen table, serious and focused, the interaction indistinguishable in its professionalism from a physician's consultation, except that it was taking place in a mountain kitchen rather than a medical office. He photographed the construction of a new house, 4 families working together on a Saturday to raise the frame of a structure that would belong to one of them. The labor exchanged in a web of mutual obligation that stretched back and forward in time, since each of the 4 families had been helped by the others in the past and would help again in the future. The whole system operating without money or written contract, on nothing more complicated than the bedrock understanding that neighbors in a difficult country need each other. He photographed the frame going up, the timber already cut and cured, the joints fitted with precision that argued for long practice, and the women bringing food for the midday meal, and the children darting underfoot, and the men on the frame moving with a sureness that was beautiful to watch. He photographed the church on Sunday mornings, the congregation gathering, the men in their best clothes. Not all of them had suits, but all of them had made an effort. And the effort itself was a kind of eloquence. The women in dresses that were sometimes homespun and sometimes store-bought and equally dignified in either case. The singing, which he couldn't photograph in any direct sense, but which he tried to capture in the faces of the singers, the opening of their mouths, the quality of attention that music produces in people who sing it rather than merely hear it. The preacher, a young man named Jesse Clampett, who had been educated at a Baptist college in Tennessee, and who was conducting, as Crisp witnessed, an institution that was simultaneously a house of worship and a community center and a school of civic organization. He photographed the trade. He went with Calvin Proctor and 2 other men on their monthly trip to Bryson City, riding in the wagon with the produce and craft goods stacked around them, jars of preserved food, dried herbs, hand-split baskets, a rocking chair that Calvin's wife had made, 3 bushels of early apples. And he photographed the transaction at the buyer's warehouse in town, the careful negotiation over prices, the cash changing hands, the community's connection to the market economy made visible. He photographed the return trip with the wagon loaded differently. Manufactured goods, salt, sugar, coffee, hardware, a bolt of factory cloth, things that could not be made at home and that required cash to obtain. The community was not self-sufficient in the utopian sense that the amber insect narrative sometimes implied. It was self-sufficient in the practical sense, meaning it produced enough of what it needed to survive and enough surplus to trade for what it couldn't produce. This was not primitivism. This was a functioning economy. He photographed the hardship too, because it was there, and he had promised to photograph what was there. He photographed the family whose roof had been damaged in a winter storm and not fully repaired, the tar paper showing through the missing shingles. He photographed the old man who had lost 3 fingers to a sawmill accident years before and who managed his farm with 7 fingers through a combination of ingenuity and habit. He photographed the thin years in the pantry, the shelves less full in late spring than in fall, the preserved food running low before the first garden crops came in, and the lines in the faces of people who had worked very hard for a long time and who showed that work. He photographed the chestnut trees dying on the ridges above the valley, their bare gray trunks visible against the living green of the oaks and maples, the blight moving through the landscape with a patience that was terrible because it was unstoppable. He photographed all of it. He was meticulous. He annotated every plate, subject, date, location, light conditions, and often a sentence or 2 of personal observation. His notebooks from this period, which survive in his archive at the University of Tennessee, show a man who understood himself to be making a record, not an argument. He photographed the bad and the good and the complicated with equal care. He made over 2,000 exposures between May and December of 1927 alone. In his notebook entry for July 14th, 1927, he wrote, "Photographed the Cable family at Sunday dinner today. 9 people around the table. The table was loaded. I have not eaten a meal that good in years." Afterwards, the old man played the banjo on the porch for 2 hours, and people came from 3 houses over to listen. I photographed as long as the light held. In my briefing document, they used the word subsistence to describe this community's economy. I have been thinking about that word all evening. It means barely surviving. It means keeping your head just above water. I don't know what community my briefing document was describing. It wasn't this one. He was not naive. He understood, by midsummer of 1927, that there was a gap opening between what he was photographing and what he had been sent to find, and that this gap had implications. He could see the direction of the project. He had read the newspapers. The North Carolina State Assembly had ceded the land for the park in 1927. The federal acquisition process was well underway. The Park Commission had its justifications ready and its arguments rehearsed, and the arguments rested in significant part on the claim that the mountain communities were already impoverished and declining, that the acquisition would improve rather than destroy lives, that the government was. And this was the specific phrase used in several public statements, rescuing families from conditions of isolation and want. He was producing evidence that contradicted this argument, frame by frame, box by box, notebook page by notebook page. He knew it. He photographed anyway. He had told Calvin Proctor he would photograph what was there, and what was there was what he was photographing. By the time he went back to Bryson City in the evenings, by the time he developed his plates in the boarding house darkroom under the red light, by the time he reviewed his annotations and filed his materials, he had arrived at a position that was uncomfortable and clear. He was not documenting a dying community. He was documenting a living one that was about to be killed. He continued. He went back up Hazel Creek. He photographed. In September of 1927, Calvin Proctor told him about the October harvest celebration. The community held it every year, he said, on the first Sunday in October. It was the largest gathering of the year. Families came in from Bone Valley and Eagle Creek, and as far as Cades Cove, across the mountains in Tennessee. There would be food from everyone's harvest, and music, and children, and a gathering of the full community, which in the context of 1927 meant something specific. The community was gathering to be counted. They were gathering to demonstrate to themselves and to whoever was watching that they were present and real and not going anywhere quietly. Crisp said he would be there with his camera. Calvin Proctor said he thought that would be appropriate. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. The morning of October 4th was cold and clear. The frost had come to the ridges but not yet to the valley bottom. The light, when it came over the eastern ridge at about 7 in the morning, was the particular amber light of early October, low-angled and saturating, the kind of light that a painter would spend a career trying to recreate, and that a photographer catches when the season and the time of day and the weather converge in the right way, which they do perhaps a dozen times in a career if you are persistent and patient and keep showing up. Crisp was there early. He set up at a position on the lower slope of the hill that gave him a perspective looking slightly uphill across the gathering ground, which would allow him to include the full arc of the hillside and the forest behind it and the sky above, while keeping the people in the middle distance where the light would fall best. He had 3 cameras with him that day. His primary, Graflex, a smaller hand camera for candid work, and a panoramic camera he had borrowed from a photographer in Bryson City for the specific purpose of capturing a large group in a single exposure. People began arriving at 8. By 10 there were, by Crisp's rough count, more than 200 people on the hillside. By noon there were certainly more. The tables, long planks on sawhorses covered with cloth, had been set up in a rough horseshoe open toward the valley, and by the time the food came out, they were loaded in a way that made Crisp think of descriptions he had read of ancient feasts, the kind of abundance that was also a demonstration of capability. There were hams and roasted chickens and stacks of cornbread and sweet potatoes and greens and preserves and pies, a dozen kinds of pies, and jugs of cider and jars of honey and bowls of pickled things and dried things and things he didn't recognize and would have needed to ask about. A band set up under a large oak on the eastern edge of the gathering ground. A man with a banjo, a man with a fiddle, a girl no older than 16 with a dulcimer, and a boy with a washtub bass. They played what Crisp recognized as old-time music, the kind that had come across the mountains in the 18th century with the Scots-Irish settlers and had been worked on and refined in these valleys for 150 years until it was something particular to this place, something that sounded simultaneously ancient and immediate, the kind of music that gets into your chest and makes decisions for your feet. Children were everywhere. They ran through the crowd and between the tables and up the hill and back down, shrieking with the specific delight of children who have been cooped up through a summer of chores and are releasing 6 months of contained energy in a single afternoon. Their faces were, and Crisp thought of this often afterward, thought of it every time he looked at the department's published photographs with their careful selection of the thinnest, most hollow-cheeked children. Their faces were the faces of healthy children, round-cheeked, bright-eyed, loud. Not one of the children he photographed that afternoon looked hungry. Not one of them looked like the children in the department's published report. And then the banner went up. He did not see who painted it or who decided on the words. He asked Calvin Proctor about it later and was told simply that people felt it was time to say it plain. 2 young men, brothers by the look of them, walked to the front of the gathering ground with the banner rolled between them, and they unfurled it on its poles and held it up, and the crowd went quiet, in the way crowds go quiet when something that has been felt for a long time is suddenly said. Proctor Community. Established 1830. Population 287. We will not leave. Crisp had the Graflex up and ready before the banner was fully extended. He pressed the shutter. He had photographed revolutions in his career. Not combat, not violence, but the civilian grammar of resistance, strikes, marches, the kinds of gatherings where ordinary people say collectively what they cannot be made to say individually, where the crowd becomes a body and the body makes a statement. He had photographed these things in cities. He had not expected to photograph them on a hillside in the Great Smoky Mountains in October light, against a background of apple orchards and blue sky, with a banjo playing somewhere to the left of the frame. But that is what he photographed. He photographed it several times from several positions, and later that night, in the red-lit boarding house room in Bryson City, he developed the best of the exposures and looked at what the silver halide had preserved, and he stopped breathing, and he made 3 copies, and he labeled one of them with 2 words that were partly ironic and partly not at all. The package went to Wallace Holt in Asheville the next morning. Crisp went back up Hazel Creek 3 days later with his camera. He had no reason yet to think that what was coming would be as total as it would turn out to be. Washington in January was cold in a different way than the mountains were cold. The mountains were cold the way a living thing is cold. The cold was in the wind moving through the trees, in the water under the ice at the creek's edges, in the breath of cattle in the barn. Washington was cold the way a stone building is cold. The cold was in the marble floors and the high ceilings and the thick walls of the Department of the Interior building on K Street, where the heat from the radiators rose to the ceiling and left the floor perpetually chill and the air perpetually formal. Crisp arrived on January 8th, 1928, with his full collection of plates and prints packed in 3 wooden crates, his field notebooks in a separate case, and a typed index of every photograph he had made, organized by date and location and subject. He had been meticulous. He had, in the previous weeks in Bryson City, reviewed everything he had shot and made a contact sheet from every roll and annotated every plate, and the result was a comprehensive documentary record of the mountain communities of the Hazel Creek drainage in the year 1927. Their institutions, their economies, their social life, their difficulties, their abundance, their resistance. Over 2,000 photographs. He met with a man named Robert Garfield, who was the senior project administrator for the Great Smokies acquisition in the department's Parks Division, in a conference room on the 4th floor that looked out over the gray January street. Garfield was a neat, orderly man in his mid-40s who wore his suits with the precision of someone for whom appearance was a professional tool. He was not unfriendly. He was simply organized around different concerns than Crisp was. They went through the index together for most of the morning. Garfield asked to see prints of specific plates. Crisp had made a selection of prints to show, understanding that the crates of glass plates were not practicable viewing material. And he looked at each one briefly, with the expression of a man reading a report rather than looking at a photograph. Crisp watched him look and understood from long experience of the way people look at photographs and the way they look at data that Garfield was not seeing what was in the images. He was seeing what was useful. After lunch, they were joined by 2 other officials whose names Crisp did not catch clearly. One was called something like Whitfield, the other he never got at all, and the character of the meeting shifted. This was no longer an inventory review. This was a selection process. The selection process proceeded in a way that Crisp would later describe in his notebooks with a precision that was itself a kind of grief. They went through his prints, and they sorted them, and the sorting principle was not quality or accuracy or historical comprehensiveness. The sorting principle was narrative. The question being asked of each photograph was not, does this accurately represent what I saw? The question was, does this support the argument we are making? The argument they were making was that the mountain communities of the Great Smokies were poor, isolated, and primitive, and that the creation of the national park with its attendant displacement of these communities was a benefit rather than a harm. The photographs that supported this argument went into one pile. The photographs that contradicted it went into another. The school at Proctor, the building itself, well maintained, 4 windows on each side, the sound of geography recitation audible if you were standing close enough. This photograph did not support the argument. Set aside. The school on examination day, the room crowded with parents who had come to hear their children recite, the care and investment of that crowd visible in their faces and their clothing. This did not support the argument. Set aside. The grist mill, recently repaired, the machinery well maintained, the line of customers that attested to its continued community function. Set aside. The mill was supposed to be crumbling. The mill was supposed to be evidence of a way of life in its terminal phase. A recently repaired mill with a current customer base was not crumbling. Set aside. Nora Cable's medical garden, labeled and organized, Nora Cable herself consulting with the young mother with the professionalism of long practice. Set aside. What the argument needed was not evidence of competence. What the argument needed was evidence of need. The need that justified intervention, that justified removal, that transformed dispossession into rescue. The family at Sunday dinner, the table loaded, 9 people healthy and well-fed. Set aside. The house raising, 4 families working together in a web of mutual obligation that had been operating for 100 years without money or contract. Set aside. Calvin Proctor and the 2 other men on their monthly trading trip to Bryson City, the transaction at the warehouse, the community's connection to the market economy. Set aside. The argument needed isolation. The argument needed the amber insect picture. The community sealed off from the modern world, unreachable and therefore unreachable by anything except government intervention. A trading trip to Bryson City was not isolation. Set aside. The orchards on the south-facing slope, the rows of apple and pear and cherry in the May morning light. Set aside. Productive orchards did not support the argument. Orchards required planning and patience and generational investment. They required the expectation of a future. You didn't plant fruit trees if you expected to be gone before they matured. The church on Sunday mornings, the congregation gathered, the singing, the preacher who had been to college in Tennessee. Set aside. Set aside. Set aside. What went into the other pile, the pile that would become the published report, was carefully selected for its ability to construct a specific portrait. There was a cabin photographed on a particularly gray morning whose light made it look desolate even though it was occupied, and its occupants were, by Crisp's observation, managing reasonably well. The occupants were not in this photograph. Crisp had taken it early, before anyone was stirring, and the composition was atmospheric. Bare trees, gray sky, the cabin's logs dark with weather. In isolation, without context, it looked like abandonment. It was not abandonment. But in the published report, it became one of the signature images. The lonely cabin, the empty landscape, the evidence of a dying way of life. There was a child Crisp had photographed at the swimming hole on Hazel Creek on a warm day in June. A girl of perhaps 8, barefoot, her feet in the water, laughing at something outside the frame. The full photograph showed the swimming hole, the summer afternoon, the absolute obvious normalcy of a child cooling her feet in a creek in June. In the selected image, the photograph was cropped to remove everything except the child from the knees up, her bare feet, her simple dress, her thin arms. The summer context, the choice, the normalcy, all of it outside the new frame. What remained was a barefoot child in a plain dress, and the caption in the published report read, "Mountain Child, Swain County, North Carolina, 1927. It became one of the most reproduced images in the entire publication. It appeared in newspapers across the country. People who saw it understood it as evidence of poverty. It was not evidence of poverty. It was evidence of summer. There was a photograph of an elderly man with a very long beard using a wooden plow on a small patch of ground. Crisp had photographed this man, whose name was Hiram Teester, 81 years old, who had been farming this same patch for 60 years. Partly because the image was striking, and partly because he was documenting the full range of agricultural practice in the community. What the full-frame photograph showed, if you looked at the background, was a modern steel plow leaning against the fence post not 15 feet from where the old man was working his wooden one. The old man used the wooden plow on this particular patch because the ground was rocky, and the wooden plow's flex allowed him to navigate the rocks without breaking the equipment. He had explained this to Crisp. The modern steel plow was for the larger fields. In the selected image, the background was cropped away. The old man and his wooden plow stood alone, context-free, ancient-looking, perfectly positioned to confirm the amber insect picture of a people living in a past century with past century tools. Crisp watched the sorting process with a feeling he would not have been able to name precisely in the moment, but which he described in his notebook that evening as watching someone build a lie out of true things. Each photograph was, individually, accurate. Each photograph showed something that had actually been there when he pressed the shutter. But the selection process was doing something to the photographs that the photographs themselves could not defend against. It was removing them from the context that gave them meaning and replacing that context with a different story, and the different story was false, even though every component image was true. He said this, as clearly as he was able, to Garfield and the two unnamed officials. He said, "The photographs you are setting aside show a functioning community with institutions and infrastructure and social organization. If you publish only the photographs in the selected pile, you will be presenting an inaccurate picture of the community's actual condition." Garfield looked at him with the patient, polite expression of a man who is prepared for this objection and has a response ready. "Your job," Garfield said, "is to document. The interpretation of the documentation is our responsibility." "The selection is interpretation," Crisp said. "Thank you for your service on this project," said the man who might have been Whitfield. The meeting was over. Crisp submitted his full set of photographs, including Exhibit A, with his formal delivery to the department on January 10th. He wrote a cover letter explaining his concerns about the selection process and the incompleteness of the published record. He was as specific as he could be, without using language that would allow them to dismiss him as political. He cited specific photographs and the specific ways in which they contradicted the published narrative, and he requested that the full collection be made available to researchers and journalists for independent review. He received a reply 3 weeks later, acknowledging receipt of his materials and thanking him for his work. The reply did not address any of his specific concerns. The Exhibit A print he had submitted with the department's copy of his collection was not among the materials when they were later archived. It had been removed. By whom and when, and with what justification, if any justification was given, the record does not say. Crisp filed a formal complaint through the department's administrative process in February. He received a form letter. He filed a second complaint in March. He was reassigned in April to a project in Montana that had nothing to do with the park acquisition. He spent the summer of 1928 photographing reclamation dams on the Missouri River. His notebooks continued. He wrote in them every evening, wherever he was, and the entries from the summer of 1928 show a man working through something that he could not resolve, turning the same questions over and over in the privacy of his own handwriting. He wrote about photography and truth, and the difference between what a photograph contains and what it is made to mean. He wrote about the families on Hazel Creek, Calvin Proctor and Nora Cable, and the school teacher Bertie Mae Higdon, and the miller Reuben Cable, and the girl he'd photographed at the swimming hole whose name he never learned. He wrote about the banner. He wrote in an entry dated July 23rd, 1928. I keep thinking about the fact that Proctor painted that banner, and the children ran under it, and the band played, and nobody in Washington will ever see the photograph. The photograph exists. The moment exists. I pressed the shutter. The light hit the film. The silver halide did what silver halide does, and that moment is preserved in a way that no one who was there could have expected, and no one in Washington has chosen to acknowledge. The community gathered and said, "We are here, and we will not leave." And the camera said, "Yes, you are right. You are here, and 287 of you are visible and real." And then the man in the conference room on K Street looked at the print and set it aside. That's the whole story, in its simplest form. The community said yes. The government said no. The camera agreed with the community. The government didn't care what the camera said. He was right that it was the whole story. He was wrong that it was simple. To say the government didn't care what the camera said understates the sophistication of what actually happened, because the government cared about cameras very much. The government understood, in 1928, that photography was not simply documentation, but argument, that photographs made claims, that photographs persuaded, that photographs could build or demolish the kind of public consensus that political projects required. The department's photography program existed precisely because it understood this. They were not indifferent to images. They were expert in them. The selection of the published photographs was not bureaucratic oversight. It was editorial control of a very high order, the systematic construction, from a large body of accurate documentary evidence, of a false but internally coherent narrative. The published report, which appeared in the autumn of 1928 under the title Survey of Mountain Communities in the Proposed Great Smoky Mountains National Park Acquisition Area, contained 312 photographs. They were organized into sections: Life in the Mountains, The Struggle for Subsistence, Community Institutions. This last section containing exactly 4 photographs, all of them showing buildings in states of disrepair, and the land. The introduction, written by an official whose name appeared nowhere on Crisp's briefing documents, described the mountain communities in terms that were measured and ostensibly sympathetic, but that rested entirely on the poverty narrative. Isolated families, limited access to education and medical care, subsistence farming on marginal land, communities in the natural process of dispersal as younger generations seek opportunities unavailable in the mountains. The barefoot summer child appeared in the Life in the Mountains section, full page, captioned, "A Child of the Mountains." These children, isolated from modern educational and medical services, represent the human cost of unmanaged wilderness. The wooden plow photograph appeared in The Struggle for Subsistence, with a caption noting the pre-industrial farming methods still practiced in many hollows. The desolate morning cabin appeared twice, once in the introduction and once in the conclusion, bracketing the argument, anchoring the narrative of decline. Nowhere in the 312 published photographs was there a school that appeared to be functioning. Nowhere was there a grist mill that appeared to be recently repaired. Nowhere was there a trading trip to Bryson City, or a Sunday congregation, or a house raising, or a harvest table loaded with food. Nowhere was there a banner. Nowhere was there a gathering of 287 people who had decided to say plainly what was being done to them. The report was received well in Washington and in the press. Several newspapers ran excerpts along with selected photographs. The New York Times ran the barefoot summer child on its front page with a caption calling her a child of the vanishing mountain culture. The story accompanying the photograph described the Great Smoky Mountains project as a humanitarian as well as a conservationist undertaking, suggesting that the creation of the park would rescue families from conditions of medieval poverty. The phrase medieval poverty was used in the Times and in 3 other major papers in reference to communities that Crisp had photographed in detail over the course of 8 months and found to be nothing of the kind. He read these newspapers in Montana, in a rooming house outside of Missoula, and wrote in his notebook, "Medieval poverty. I've been trying to figure out what Reuben Cable's grist mill has in common with the Middle Ages, and the best I can do is that both involve grain being ground by a wheel. But then again, so does a flour mill in Kansas City. I suppose they didn't photograph those either." In the autumn of 1928, approximately 3 months after the published report was distributed, Crisp received a letter from Wallace Holt in Asheville. The letter was brief. Holt said he had received the package. He said he understood the significance of the photograph. He said he was watching the political situation carefully. He said he thought publication at the current moment, while the park negotiations were still in progress and the community's legal resistance was ongoing, would be counterproductive. It would be characterized as advocacy journalism. It would provoke political retaliation against the paper, and it would be dismissed by the Park Commission as exactly the kind of sentimental obstruction that was delaying progress on a project of genuine public benefit. He said he was not killing the photograph. He was holding it. He would keep it safe. Crisp wrote back. He said he understood Holt's reasoning. He said he disagreed with it. He said that the reason to publish was not sentiment, but documentation. The photograph was a historical record that contradicted an official claim, and the time to present evidence was when the evidence was still relevant to the outcome. He said that once the park was established, once the communities were removed, the photograph would no longer be able to change anything. It would only record what had been done. Holt did not reply immediately. When he did, his letter said, "You may be right, but I am not willing to risk the paper on a fight we cannot win this year. Trust me to hold it safely. The moment will come." The moment did not come. Not then. Not in the way Crisp had hoped. The legal resistance that Calvin Proctor and the other community leaders had been organizing continued through the late 1920s and into the 1930s. It was not without effect. several communities negotiated life tenure agreements that allowed elderly residents to remain on their land for the duration of their natural lives. Some families received compensation that, while not generous, was at least a formal acknowledgement of what was being taken. The legal process slowed the removal timeline and, in some cases, altered its terms, but it did not stop the removal. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was officially established in 1934 when President Roosevelt dedicated it on a hillside in Tennessee. The acquisition of private land within the park boundaries continued through the 1930s and into the 1940s. The last holdouts, families who had received life tenure agreements or who had refused to negotiate at all, were removed in the early 1940s. The Proctor community on Hazel Creek held on longer than most. Calvin Proctor had retained a lawyer and had filed suit challenging the condemnation of the community's land on the grounds that the park's legislative justification had misrepresented the community's condition. The suit cited, among other things, the discrepancy between the published photographic survey and what the community's own records showed. It was a courageous suit, and it had some legal merit, and it went nowhere for the same reason that most legal challenges to federal acquisition authority went nowhere in the 1930s. The courts were not, in that era, receptive to arguments that would have required unwinding a congressional act based on evidentiary claims about what the communities were actually like. The suit was dismissed in 1938. Calvin Proctor continued to live in the Proctor community with his wife and his youngest daughter and her family for 3 more years under a life tenure agreement negotiated after the dismissal. He died in 1941. His wife and daughter were removed in 1942. Nora Cable was the last person in the Proctor community proper. She had refused every agreement and every offer and every conversation with Park Service officials. She was, by 1942, in her late 70s or early 80s. She had never been sure of her own age, a fact she found amusing. And she was still living in the house where she had been born, tending the medicinal garden behind it, treating anyone who came to her with the knowledge she had accumulated over 7 or 8 decades of practice. The Park Service was, in 1942, extraordinarily reluctant to physically remove an elderly woman from her home. The war was on. The country had larger concerns. The optics of forcing an octogenarian from her family's land did not serve anyone's interests. She remained until 1944. In February of that year, 2 Park Service rangers and a county sheriff's deputy came to her door and told her that she had to go. She asked where. They said to relatives in Bryson City. She had relatives in Bryson City, a niece she had not seen in a decade. She packed a single wooden box with her seeds. She would not leave without her seeds, she said, because the plants could be grown anywhere, and the knowledge was in the seeds. And she walked to the Park Service vehicle, and she sat in the back seat without speaking. The houses of the Proctor community were burned by the Park Service in 1944. The burning was standard procedure. Structures left standing attracted vagrants, created maintenance obligations, and served as nodes of continued trespass by former residents who might otherwise be discouraged by a truly empty landscape. The Park Service had burned structures in other removed communities as well. It was policy, not malice. Whether the distinction mattered to the people whose houses were burning was not recorded. The school where Bertie Mae Higdon had taught geography to children who would later be told their community didn't really exist. Burned. The church with the flower bed and the bell tower. Burned. The general store with its sign in good condition and its shelves of mixed manufactured and home goods. Burned. The mill was not burned. The structure was old and solid, and the Park Service determined it had historical value, but it was never operated again. Reuben Cable had been dead for 4 years by then, and there was no one left who knew how to dress the millstones. The foundations remained. The chimneys remained. The cemetery remained, as cemeteries tend to do, because even the forces that destroy communities observe certain limits. The headstones in the Proctor Community Cemetery dated from the 1840s through the 1940s, and they marked, in their aggregate, 100 years of continuous habitation by people who had been living on that land before there was a state of North Carolina, and certainly before there was a Department of the Interior. The orchards remained for a while. Apple trees are patient. They kept producing for years after the families who had planted them were gone. Hikers who passed through the Hazel Creek area in the late 1940s and 1950s sometimes reported finding apples lying on the ground in the autumn, red and perfect, no one to pick them, the trees performing their annual function for an absent audience. The Park Service eventually cleared the orchard ground. The old trees were removed. New growth forest reclaimed the slope. Harlan Crisp was not present for any of this. He had been reassigned from the Parks Project in 1928 and never returned to Swain County in a professional capacity. He continued his career as a documentary photographer through the 1930s, working for various government agencies, briefly for a picture magazine, eventually freelancing. And the work was good, though it never achieved the prominence of some of his contemporaries. He was a careful photographer and an honest one, but honesty was not always what the market wanted. He kept his personal archive. All 1,600 photographs from the 1927 Swain County assignment that had not been submitted to the department, the selection he had withheld as his own record, separate from the official submission, traveled with him from assignment to assignment, through 3 apartments in Washington, a house in Virginia, and finally a smaller house outside of Knoxville, where he spent his last years. He never exhibited them. He never tried to publish them as a collection. He had tried, in 1928 and 1929, to get various newspapers and magazines interested in the discrepancy between what he had photographed and what the department had published. And the interest had been polite, but not operational. There were always reasons why now wasn't the right moment, why the politics were too complicated, why the story didn't quite fit what the publication was looking for. He gave up trying to place the story eventually and simply kept the archive. He maintained it with the same meticulous care he brought to everything photographic, the plates properly stored, the prints properly interleaved, the notebooks in order and legible. He annotated photographs that needed further annotation. He occasionally, in the evenings, took out prints and looked at them. Among the prints he looked at was the one he labeled Exhibit A. His copy, the one he had made for his personal archive, on the night in October 1927, when the image had risen out of the developer and stopped his breathing, was in a glassine envelope inside the portfolio case, filed under Proctor Community October 1927. He had not mounted it or framed it or treated it with any special distinction in the physical archive, but his notebooks showed that he returned to it repeatedly, that it was the photograph from that year, from that project, from that period of his career, that he could not leave alone. He wrote about it in 1935, after the park was formally established, in an entry that said, "I have been thinking about what it means to make a photograph of something that is then destroyed. The thing exists in the photograph and not in the world. The world has been changed. The photograph has not. The photograph remains an argument, even after the argument has lost in the real world. Is it worth anything to have this argument in a box? I genuinely don't know. I know that Proctor's banner said, 'We will not leave,' and they left because they were made to leave, and the banner doesn't exist anymore. But the photograph of the banner does exist, and the photograph includes every face on that hillside, every person who came to be counted. I counted them once, one afternoon in Virginia, when I had nothing better to do. 212 faces I could count clearly. The others are present, but not individually distinct at the photograph's resolution. 212 faces of people who were told they didn't matter enough to warrant the country's knowledge of their existence. They exist in this photograph. It seems important that they continue to exist somewhere." He wrote about it again in 1952, when a magazine article about the National Park's 20th anniversary described the Hazel Creek area in terms that made no mention of the communities that had been there, speaking instead of primeval forest and untouched wilderness, language that required the human history of the area to simply not exist. The word primeval means before human memory. Someone who uses primeval to describe Hazel Creek has apparently decided that the memory of the Proctor community, the Cables and the Proctors and the Higdons and everyone else on those slopes, does not qualify as memory. I wonder if that is because the memory is inconvenient, or because the people who hold it have been so thoroughly dispersed and diminished that their memory doesn't reach the offices where articles like this are written. Both, probably. And here I am, sitting on Exhibit A, which would at minimum require someone to spell primeval differently. He died in 1961 in Knoxville of a heart condition that had been diagnosed several years earlier and that he had managed, as he managed most things, by continuing to work and paying attention to what was in front of him rather than what he could not change. He was 73. He had been a documentary photographer for 55 years. His obituary in the Knoxville News Sentinel was 8 sentences long and noted his work for the Department of the Interior in the 1920s and 1930s without further specification. His archive, the 1,600 and something prints and plates from his personal collection, including everything from the Swain County assignment, was donated by his estate to the University of Tennessee in 1974, 13 years after his death. The donation was made by his daughter, who had kept the archive in storage through the intervening years, and who, when the university expressed interest, arranged the transfer with the practicality of someone who wanted the material to be safe rather than lost. The University of Tennessee received it, cataloged it, and stored it. In the 1990s, as part of a broader archiving initiative, the prints were digitized, each image scanned at high resolution, the annotations from the corresponding notebooks keyed to the digital files, the whole collection made available in principle to researchers through the library system. It was thorough, careful work. It made Crisp's archive accessible in a way it had never been during his lifetime. Exhibit A was not in it. The print was not in the portfolio case when the archive was transferred to the university. The glassine envelope under Proctor, Community, October 1927, was present in the filing system, but empty. Whatever had happened to the print between Crisp's last notebook entry in 1958, when he mentioned it in the context of a documentary film about Appalachia that had gotten some details wrong, and the archive's transfer to the university in 1974, is not known. Crisp's daughter said she had not removed it. She said she had not known it had a special significance. She said, when asked about it specifically, that she thought there had been a print in that envelope when she last checked the archive years before, but she couldn't be certain, and the archive was very large, and she hadn't opened every envelope. Which brings us to Wallace Holt and the Asheville Citizen-Times. Holt had held the print. He had held it, as he promised, safely. He had not published it during the park negotiations. He had not published it during the removals. He had not published it after the park was established, because by then, as Crisp had predicted in his 1928 letter, the photograph could no longer change anything. It could only record what had been done, and the record of what had been done was not a story that any editor in the late 1940s or early 1950s wanted to lead with when the national mood was focused on forward motion, and the national park in the Smokies was already drawing visitors in the hundreds of thousands and generating the kind of economic activity and national pride that made retrospective criticism feel not just impolitic, but almost unpatriotic. Holt retired from the Citizen-Times in 1955. He died in 1963. What happened to the print between his retirement and his death is not documented. His papers, donated to a local historical society in the 1970s, include correspondence with Crisp from 1928 and 1929, and a brief reference in a 1951 diary entry to the Proctor photograph from Harlan, still in the drawer. Whether the drawer in question was at the Citizen-Times office or at his home is not specified. What is documented is what happened in 1998. In the spring of 1998, a graduate student in journalism at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, named Dara Sizemore, was working on a thesis about the history of the Asheville Citizen-Times's coverage of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park creation. She was working in the paper's archives, which were at that point in a somewhat disorganized state due to several relocations over the years, and in a misfiled box of 1927 to 1930 materials, she found the print. She knew immediately that it was significant. She had been reading the history carefully enough to know what the Proctor community was, and she was young enough and far enough from the political sensitivities of 1927 to be frankly astonished by what she was looking at. She found the note in Crisp's handwriting. "Don't publish this yet, but don't lose it." Still tucked in the paper wrapping with the print. She photographed the note with her own camera before she did anything else. She wrote about the discovery in her thesis, which was submitted in May of 1999 and received the departmental prize for historical journalism that year. The thesis was titled "The Photograph That Wasn't Printed: Image Selection and Narrative Construction in the Department of the Interior's 1928 survey of Great Smoky Mountains communities. It circulated within academic journalism programs and reached a small but attentive readership. In 2003, the Ramsey Regional Activity Center at Western Carolina University mounted a small exhibit on the history of the displaced communities of the Great Smokies, drawing on a variety of archival sources, including CRISP's digitized collection at the University of Tennessee and, for the first time, Exhibit A. Sizemore had connected with the university's history department, and through that connection, the print, still in the Citizen Times archive, finally formally cataloged thanks to Sizemore's discovery, was loaned to the exhibit. It hung in the gallery for 3 weeks. The photograph, printed large for the exhibit, roughly 24 by 30 inches, which was the size at which its details became fully legible, was everything that CRISP's notebooks had said it was. The October hillside, the long tables, the crowd of 200 and more. The band under the oak tree, the fiddle player with his eyes closed, the girl with the dulcimer leaning slightly toward the woman next to her, as if sharing something in the music, the children in motion, a blur at the edges of the frame where 2 boys had been running past at the moment of exposure, the elders seated at the near end of the table, one man with his hat off, another woman laughing at something with her head thrown back, and in the foreground, held upright by the 2 young men on either side, the banner, Proctor Community, established 1830, population 287, we will not leave. In the upper left corner of the photograph, caught by the wide angle and the excellent October light, the orchards on the south-facing slope were visible. Neat rows, heavy with late fruit, the trees in their full autumn color of rust and gold. In the background, the forest climbed the ridge behind the community, dark green and particular, the specific forest of this specific valley, the trees that had watched these families for 100 years and would watch for 100 more after they were gone. At the bottom right corner of the photograph, caught by accident in the composition, CRISP had been focused on the banner and the crowd and had not noticed, was a detail that no one had remarked on until the 2003 exhibit, when an elderly woman from Bryson City came to see the photograph because her grandmother had been a member of the Proctor community, and she wanted to see if she could find her in the image. She could not find her grandmother. But she found, in the bottom right corner of the photograph, a small child sitting alone at the edge of the frame on what appeared to be an overturned bucket, eating something, a piece of pie, perhaps, or cornbread, with the concentrated, unself-conscious focus of a child who has decided that eating is the only thing happening in the world right now. The child was perhaps 4 years old. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at her food with an expression of pure contentment. The elderly woman from Bryson City looked at this child for a long time. Then she said, "That might be my grandmother. She would have been about that age." She was not certain. The photograph's resolution at the bottom corner, where the light was slightly less direct, did not permit certainty. But she stood in front of the print for a long time, with her hand not quite touching the glass, looking at the small figure with her food and her contentment. And what was happening in her face was something the gallery visitors around her understood without needing to be told, because it was the face of someone recognizing the possibility of presence, the possibility that someone they loved was real and had been there, had eaten pie in October sunlight on a hillside that no longer existed. 3 weeks after the exhibit opened, the Swain County Historical Society formally requested that the photograph be removed from display. The request was made in a letter to the university's administration, and the language of the letter was careful. The society did not say the photograph was inaccurate. It did not dispute its provenance. It said that displaying the photograph in the current context risked reopening unresolved legal disputes between Swain County, the state, and the federal government regarding the terms of the park's establishment and the obligations arising from the displacement of mountain communities. It noted that there were ongoing negotiations between Swain County and the Park Service regarding a North Shore road that had been promised as compensation for the flooding of mountain cemeteries during the creation of Fontana Lake in the 1940s, and that the introduction of inflammatory historical materials could complicate these negotiations. The reference to the North Shore Road was specific and telling. The road had been promised to Swain County in 1943 as part of a deal in which the county agreed to have its mountain cemeteries flooded. The road was never built. For 60 years, the families of people buried in those cemeteries had been trying to get either the road built or adequate compensation for its non-building. The case was, in 2003, still unresolved and genuinely contentious. The Historical Society was not wrong that the political environment was delicate. The university administration, after some internal deliberation, asked that the photograph be returned to the Citizen-Times archive at the conclusion of the exhibit's scheduled run, rather than extending its display. The exhibit closed on schedule. The photograph went back to Asheville. The negotiations over the North Shore Road continued for several more years and ultimately resulted in a financial settlement in 2010, in which the federal government paid Swain County approximately $52 million in lieu of building the road. The cemeteries are still underwater. The people who can no longer visit the graves of their grandparents received a check from a government that flooded those graves decades before any of them were born. After the exhibit closed, the Exhibit A print remained in the Citizen-Times archive for 5 more years. The paper had been sold and reorganized several times since the 1920s, and its physical archive was not a priority for any of the new owners. Sizemore, who was by this point working as a journalist in Charlotte, corresponded with the archive staff about the print's condition and storage, and eventually, in 2007, raised the alarm about the archive's general deterioration. She was told that there were no resources for improved storage, and that the archive might be deaccessioned in a future consolidation. In 2008, the print was sold. The circumstances of the sale are not fully public. It was a private transaction involving the newspaper's parent company and an individual buyer, and the price was not disclosed. The buyer was a private collector in the Southeast who, so far as the public record shows, has never sought to exhibit the photograph or to publish it commercially. He purchased it, he said, in the single documented exchange he has had with a journalist about the acquisition, because a photograph of people who were told they didn't matter is the most important kind of photograph there is. He was asked whether he intended to donate it to a public institution. He said he was thinking about it. That was in 2008. It is now, as these words are being read or spoken, many years later. The photograph is still in private hands. No museum has displayed it as part of a permanent exhibit. The University of Tennessee's digitized collection of Crisp's work, all 1,600 and some photographs, annotated, searchable, accessible to researchers, does not include it. You can spend hours in that archive and see the school and the mill and the orchards and the Sunday congregation and the house raising and the trading trip to Bryson City. Everything that Crisp photographed and kept and cared for, and you will not find Exhibit A. The reason is simple, and it is the same reason the photograph has never found a permanent institutional home, despite the genuine importance of what it shows. The photograph is not simply a historical document, it is an argument. And the argument it makes, that the communities of the Great Smoky Mountains were thriving when the government said they were dying, that the dispossession was a choice and not a rescue, that the banner on the hillside said something true that the government needed to say was false, is an argument that institutions that have a relationship with the National Park Service, or with federal funding, or with the political culture of Swain County and Western North Carolina, find very difficult to make permanent, very difficult to put behind glass and label and light properly, and invite school groups to stand in front of. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the most visited national park in America. 11 million people walk its trails each year. Most of them pass through the Hazel Creek area without knowing that 287 people once lived there, built there, celebrated there, planted orchards there, rang a school bell there, ground grain there, healed each other there, buried their parents there, raised their children there. If you hike to the Proctor site today, you can find foundation stones jutting from the forest floor where houses once stood. You can find chimney stacks rising from the leaf litter, still perfectly plumb, built by someone who knew that a chimney needs to be plumb, or the house smokes, built by someone who expected the house to stand. You can find cemetery headstones dating back to the 1830s. The names cut into stone by hands that expected the names to remain readable, expected that someone would come and read them, expected a future in which the living would visit the dead and understand the connection. You cannot find the banner. You cannot find the harvest table. You cannot find the band. You cannot find the girl with the dulcimer leaning toward her neighbor, or the children who were a blur at the edge of the frame, or the elder with his head thrown back in laughter, or the two young men holding the banner poles, or the small child in the bottom right corner eating her pie with complete concentration in October sunlight. Those things exist only in a photograph that Harlan Crisp took on an afternoon in 1927. A photograph that showed the truth the government preferred not to see, that the mountains were not empty. They were full. And what filled them was removed not by nature or by time or by the inevitable march of progress, but by policy, by deliberate decision, by the conscious choice to build something beautiful on a foundation that required forgetting what had been there before. This is the thing that cannot be resolved by looking at the park. The park is genuinely beautiful. The trails are genuinely extraordinary. The biodiversity of the Great Smokies, over 19,000 species documented, more than any comparably sized area in the temperate world, is a real and irreplaceable treasure. The 11 million people who visit each year experience something genuine. The conservation of the land is, by any ecological measure, a success. These things are true, and also true. 287 people gathered on a hillside in October 1927 and painted a banner and said, "We will not leave," and they were made to leave, and their houses were burned, and the official record said they had been living in medieval poverty and needed to be rescued, and the photographs that showed otherwise were set aside in a conference room in Washington, and most of them have never been publicly exhibited. Both things are true at the same time. The park is beautiful, and the people were real, and the method was wrong. This is the kind of truth that photographs are particularly suited to hold, because photographs don't resolve contradictions. They preserve them. The image of 212 countable faces on a hillside in October 1927 does not resolve the question of whether the park was worth it. It simply insists that those faces were there. It simply refuses to allow the answer to be that they were not. Harlan Crisp died in 1961. His personal archive, all 1,600 unpublished photographs from his years with the Department of the Interior and beyond, was donated to the University of Tennessee in 1974. They have been digitized, cataloged, annotated, and made available to researchers. They have never been exhibited as a collection. Exhibit A is not among them. Its location is known only to the private collector who purchased it in 2008 for an undisclosed sum. When asked why he bought it, the collector said, "Because a photograph of people who were told they didn't matter is the most important kind of photograph there is." The foundation stones are still in the forest above Hazel Creek. The chimney stacks are still plumb. The headstones are still readable if you know where to look. If you bring a brush to clear the lichen, if you have the patience to let the names come clear. People go there sometimes, descendants, historians, hikers who've read the right books. They stand in the trees where the houses were, and they try to imagine what it sounded like when the community was full. They cannot fully imagine it. The photograph can show them. If they could ever see it,